Hello, everybody. It's good to be here with you all. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today's webinar presentation, Mr. Paul Cruickshank. Paul comes from a military background, having served with the British Army for 20 years. He's a graduate of the British Army Command and Staff College and was later appointed member of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth in 1999. For his contribution to strategic military planning for peace support operations in the Balkans. His last deployment in the Army was to Afghanistan at the end of 2001 as part of the international effort to remove the Taliban regime and commence reconstruction across the country. Paul joined the UN in Afghanistan in 2002 and helped set up, plan, and implement the Afghan disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. At the end of the disarmament and demobilization, he moved to Indonesia to set up and manage support to the Indonesian government's response to the 2004 tsunami. In 2006, Paul was posted to Iraq as senior advisor on security sector reform. In 2009, he moved to Kosovo to manage the support to security sector reform program before returning to Afghanistan in 2010 to set up and run UK DFID's M&E program in Helmand province. He rejoined the UN in early 2011 before being posted to South Sudan as director and representative in early 2015. Paul returned to Afghanistan in May 2017 as UNOPS director and representative, a position he held until returning from the UN at the end of 2021. Paul is now the founder and CEO of Phil and Rose Limited, a discrete management consultancy seeking in both the public and private sectors to apply lessons learned over the last 20 years so that more can be done with less and all can be done better. So I'd like to introduce you to Paul, and it is with great pleasure. As a former UNOPS employee myself, I'd like to introduce you to Paul. Paul, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your very generous introduction there, Rosanna, and my thanks to you, to Pat and all colleagues at the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a great pleasure and an equal privilege for me to talk to you about a subject which is very dear to my heart, and that is, of course, Afghanistan. As has been already mentioned, my experience of Afghanistan is reasonably substantive, both within the military and latterly with the United Nations. And indeed, nearly the last 15 of my 20 years have been spent inside Afghanistan, and my time there ended at the end of December last year. Perhaps rather uniquely, my time in Afghanistan started with regime change, and my time, sadly, also finished with regime change. But I'm going to talk to you today, and I hope what I will do is inform and incur some interest on your part. But before we go any further, I would just like to make it very clear that any views and opinions expressed during the course of this presentation are personal. They're mine and mine alone, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any organization, including but not limited to the United Nations. In terms of the format, we'll get the introduction out of the way, and then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the historical overview as far as Afghanistan is concerned. I'll spend a little bit of time on this, not too much time, but I think it is important so that people understand where the Afghans are, and more importantly, where they've come from and what they've had to go through in order to get where they are today. We'll then have a look at the international aid effort in terms of delivering aid to the Afghan people. And then we'll look at some of the projects, some of the key projects that have been implemented with the agency that I was particularly connected to in most of the years that I was in Afghanistan, before turning our attention very briefly looking at some of the security and risks issues, which are absolutely part of everyday life in the country before the Taliban and after the Taliban's reemergence last year. And I'll talk for, I hope, less than 30 minutes, which I think will then leave, as I understand it, plenty of time for questions and answers, assuming there may be some questions, which I'll be more than happy to answer. So moving on to the historical overview. First thing up, I'd like to draw your attention to is the position of Afghanistan. It is, of course, a country which sits very much on the epicenter of what used to be called the Silk Road. The country itself borders with Iran to the west, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan to the north, a very small border with China in the northeast, and a very significant border, a very porous border in the east with Pakistan. The country itself, as you'll no doubt be aware, is landlocked and is a mixture of mountains, plains, and desert, with the highest peaks over 24,500 feet, nearly 7,500 meters. Being on the Silk Road, previously and historically, has no doubt influenced trade, culture, ethnicity, and sadly, but realistically, conflict. The country has a long history of domination by foreign conquerors and strife amongst internally warring factions and warlords. It sits at the gateway between Asia and Europe, and this land has been conquered as far back as Darius I of Babylonia, as early as about 500 BC, by Alexander the Great in 329 BC, and subsequently by the likes of Genghis Khan and the Mughals in the 13th century. Buddhism, and then the domination of Islam, from a religious point of view, have been overwhelmingly important. In terms of the ethnic divide, ethnicity, affected by its historical interference by outside cultures, is now dominated by Pashtuns and Tajiks in particular. And I hope this slide demonstrates really quite clearly where those two ethnic groupings who dominate the cultural, ethnic, political, and to a certain extent the security environments of Afghanistan lie. You'll see that the Pashtuns, which traditionally lead in Afghanistan, are very much from the west through the south to the east, with the Tajiks more north. And in the center, and really quite significantly, the Hazaras, Shia Muslim compared to the Tajiks and Pashtuns, who are Sunni Muslim. And up in the north, Uzbeks, close to Uzbekistan, Turkmens, and others along the northern borders, with the stans to the north. Afghanistan, most recently, and I'm talking about from the 19th century onwards, was a great victim of the Great War, the Great Game, predominantly between the British and the Russian empires. Encompassed probably most notably by the Afghan wars with Britain, 3 of those wars in the 19th and even up to and including the early 20th centuries. This picture here is a painting of the infamous last stand by the British at a place called Gandamat, while the British were evacuating and withdrawing, or let's be frank about it, retreating from Kabul in 1842. And the theme here is one that will become clear as we move forward. As we go into the 20th century, latterly in the 20th century, in 1973, we see the overthrow of the last Afghan king, Mohammad Zahir Shah. And by 1978, the communists had taken control, with Moscow launching its invasion to support the puppet regime in December 1979. This led, as you will be aware, to a 10-year jihad, with Mujahideen supported by the principal Western powers, and including and through Pakistan. The scene you see here on the screen, of course, is an infamous picture of the Soviet army withdrawing from Afghanistan in 1989, after 10 years of invasion, occupation, and overall failure. After the Soviet withdrawal, internal conflict took place, with Najibullah's communist regime being ousted by the Mujahideen in 1992. This led to the warlords infighting, setting conditions for the rise of the Taliban, who subsequently took Kabul in 1996, executing Najibullah in September that year. This photo, incidentally, on the screen at the moment, not my photograph, but I put it in there because this was taken 1 month after the Taliban occupied and took control of Kabul in 1996. I took this photograph in Kabul in January 2002. And as you can see, sadly, not a lot of difference structurally from an infrastructure perspective of the city between 1996 and 2002. 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, with the Taliban refusing to hand over Osama bin Laden, led to ultimate regime change. And of course, you're all familiar with that. This is Hamid Karzai accepting the votes at the emergency lawyer Jirga in June 2002. And he was accepting the position of leader of what was known at the time as the interim administration. This created a sense of hope and excitement, and it was tangible. It was something you could wake up to and feel and smell every day early in 2002. It was the dawn of a new era, or at least it was selling itself as the dawn of a new era. But the new era, of course, was thwarted early on by the rising insurgency, once the Taliban had had an opportunity to regroup. And the history of the last 20 years has been dominated by the presence of the West, the international community, and by the resurging Taliban, and latterly other anti-government elements and groups, terrorist groups, that joined the mix. The military-led intervention was designed not only to effect regime change, but thereafter to set the conditions for a stable and prosperous Afghanistan. Expectations were high. Women and children were to be given freedoms, the likes of which hadn't been experienced since the late 1970s. The agricultural economy was to be enhanced and alternatives found for poppy growers. Much needed development programs were initiated countrywide with a central focus on establishing government and civil service capacity. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, all were constructed at an almost alarming rate. But the development space began to close from 2004 onwards as the Taliban and other groups, as I said, gained in strength, corruption became endemic, and Afghan support for the international presence dwindled. As you can see from this article from the UK's Times newspaper in 2019, the conflict was raging and development was hemorrhaging. I want now to have a look at some fairly sad statistics here, which are the civilian deaths over the period of Western intervention since regime change took place in 2001, 2002. You can see the figures are fairly significant. They were low when the Taliban were removed, and noticeably in 2003 was the time of the first suicide attack, an incident which took the Afghans by surprise as much as anybody, myself included. The numbers increased. Civilian deaths were a major concern to all, not just the Afghans, but also the international community, and in particular the United Nations from a human rights perspective. And this line here, which you can see on the screen, coincides with President Obama's troop surge in 2010. By the time the US combat mission or the NATO mission had stopped in terms of military intervention and changed to a training and support, they were about as high as they were ever going to be. They did go a little bit higher and then started to come back down again once the Doha Agreement had been signed between the Trump administration and the Afghans. The Taliban, I beg your pardon. These are the Afghans. These are the people who had the hope. These are the people who were enthusiastic about embracing change. These are the people that for the last 20 years, the majority of us have committed to serving and making sure that they were given the basic human rights, that we would manage and reach and meet their expectations. Girls back in school, old men able to travel freely. This old gentleman is making his way to Mecca. These are the people that we are there to help. These are the people who need desperately that help, not only in years gone by, but in the time ahead. I now want to move across and have a look at international aid delivery in the country over the last 20 years. What you see here is a graph which indicates by billions on the left over 18 years from 2002 to 2019, the amount of international aid that was flowing into Afghanistan. It was significant. And by the end of 2019, $64.4 billion had been injected into the Afghan development economy. That is significant not only in terms of the quantity of dollars, but it's also significant in terms of the expectations that one could realistically have in terms of how that money could have been or should have been spent. Expectations held by international taxpayers, from where most of this funding came, and most notably by the Afghans themselves. And just to be clear, this is international aid, and I do not include here military spending, which was far in excess of this figure. In terms of who is providing the majority of this, as you can see on the screen here, the top 10 donors of gross ODA between 2018 and 2019 in US dollar millions. Obviously, and not surprisingly, the US were and have been top throughout. But others there are also notable by their large contribution. And fortunately, during my time delivering on behalf of the United Nations, we partnered with all of these partners throughout that period. How was the money spent? In general terms, that money between 2018 and 19, which is fairly indicative of the entire passage of time between 02 and 20, you see that the majority of the funding was going to what is called other social infrastructure and services. Perhaps not enough to education at 9%, and perhaps not enough to economic infrastructure and services. Production. Afghanistan is obviously an agricultural-based economy. It doesn't have much in terms of production outside the agricultural base. This, I believe, will be an area in terms of quantity of money and where the money and how the money was spent that will need to be analyzed in time to come and strategic lessons learned as a result. To make sure that in future, when such interventions take place, that the right amount of money is spent at the right time in the right place and, most importantly, for the right purpose, which may not have been the case over the period we're talking about in Afghanistan itself. So now I'll move on to give you a flavor for the types of projects that were being implemented across Afghanistan. I was fortunate enough to be part of a UN agency, which at the majority of times was spread across the entire country. At least 33 out of 34 provinces at one time we had a foothold in. We've been there for more than 25 years, which actually means that we were there during the last Taliban regime and operated under that regime, which was, to date, as far as things stand at the moment, significantly different to the current Taliban regime. It was much harsher, it was less forgiving, but it did, like it does today in its new guise, accommodate and welcome international aid. Up until recently, we had offices in the main provincial centers in Kabul, Herat in the west, and Mazar-e-Sharif in the north, and the team was 230 plus. It did fluctuate from time to time, but as you see, mostly comprised of Afghan men and women. As at 2020, we had a portfolio of in excess of $650 million with over 20 projects and programs operational at that particular time. And as I've already explained, operating with a host of international partners. what was our vision? Up until the time I left anyway, our vision was to be a partner of choice for sustainable reconstruction and development, a focus on sustainability, a very key aspect today, not only in Afghanistan, but on a global context as well. We were to deliver first-class, effective, socially, environmentally responsive project and procurement management, which was part of our agency mandate, and we're to be transparent and accountable to stakeholders, absolutely key in an environment, a fragile state environment such as Afghanistan, transparency, and imposing and advocating and encouraging our clients, namely the Afghan institutions, also to be both transparent and accountable. And of course, we're to be inspiring and giving the chance for people to be the best they could, not only our own people, but the beneficiaries for whom we were there to work. And it was all encapsulated in the mission statement that I had in place at the time, which was to exceed the expectations of all stakeholders in the delivery of our services at all times, in all places, and in all circumstances, in order to improve significantly the lives of all Afghans in need, irrespective, therefore, of culture, irrespective of ethnic background or any other criteria. And what's important here is in all places, in all circumstances. And for me, it was extremely important to make sure that we could deliver against that part of the mission statement, bearing in mind that quite often it was very difficult and very challenging to get into parts of the country, especially more rural parts, because of that ever worsening security situation that was prevailing as we went through the time of years between 2002 onwards. Looking at our partners, what I wanted to stress here is how much we were working with particular key donor partners. And you'll see here that our key donors, Sweden, Japan, and Italy, funded the vast majority of our portfolio and were very committed to helping the Afghan people. Australia was also significant, the World Bank, the United States less so in the latter years. And you'll also see, perhaps surprisingly, reference to NATO there, because in the last 4 years, we did actually support NATO's mission by helping build the infrastructure necessary to allow the Afghan security sector to develop and establish its capacity so that it could indeed stand up on its own 2 feet. And we can talk about that later, because obviously in terms of standing on its own 2 feet, it proved incapable of doing that. The next slide of stakeholder mapping, I'm putting up really not because I want you to focus on the detail of exactly which stakeholders are in this map, but I want instead to draw your attention to the red dots. Those red stakeholders are Afghan institutions, basically government, our principal clients, different elements of government, different ministries, many of them key line ministries. And the reason I would draw your attention to that is because they were our key stakeholders. And in August last year, every red dot you can see on that screen disappeared. Worth thinking about, and maybe we can come back to that later on. In terms of the portfolio overview, this is just going to be a quick run through just to show you the different types of things that we were doing. Incidentally, this is Bamyan Airport, which we also built with Japanese funding. But our portfolio itself stretched from horizontal to vertical infrastructure, the capacity building, governance projects where we worked embedded within key line ministries to build our capacity, put systems in place, and try and deal with their ineptitude when it came to bureaucracy, and in particular, trying to overcome the rampant corruption that existed throughout government. And also operational support projects, which were mainly internal to the United Nations, being able to facilitate other sister agencies, being able to deliver also on their mandates. The Rural Access Improvement Program took place in northern Afghanistan, again, alongside 4 provinces in the north. This was Swedish CEDA funded, and it ran for more than 10 years. Our main focus was building bridges, roads, building capacity, and also had a large gender component. And I think the key lesson that came out of this engagement, because it was such a long engagement in excess of 10 years, it allowed us to effect what I call attitudinal change, basically cultural change. Insofar as when we started, it was very traditional. There was great reluctance to accommodate the gender aspects to this program. But by the time we finished, households were clamoring for their women to be given jobs, for their women to be educated, for their girls to be educated, the likes of which I had not seen and have not ever seen elsewhere in Afghanistan. We worked up in the Hindu Kush, the Trans-Hindu Kush Road Connectivity Program, in order to try and connect better north and south of Afghanistan with limited lines of communication, namely over the Salang Pass and through the Salang Tunnel, which was, when it was built by the Soviets in the 1950s, was the highest tunnel in the world. Putting in major road systems, including the, for example, the Herat bypass, in order not only to give them transport infrastructure, but to seek the benefits, the long-term impact that such road infrastructure can bring. Herat being a major economic center of the country, albeit in the west, bordering Iran, much trade into and out of Afghanistan, almost allowing trade to move from India through Pakistan, through Afghanistan and into Iran and onwards, akin to the original Silk Road theory. The Humanitarian Call Center, a small but very significant intervention, which we were able to set up and run and continue to run to this day, whereby a free, toll-free number is accessible to every Afghan in the country who can seek the assistance through this humanitarian call center, which logs problems, passes it on to humanitarian actors, and then most importantly, follows up to ensure that the needs of the people calling have indeed been served. Infrastructure, heavy infrastructure in Kabul and elsewhere, building security infrastructure as well as services infrastructure, providing more roads and bridges, in this case, in Kabul city itself, allowing greater movement of an ever-increasing vehicle population. Water supplies, this project focusing on the disturbed area to the north of Kabul, where there is an aspiration to build a new capital city, which is unlikely now to take place. Renewable energy, this is the first hybrid renewable energy plant built in Afghanistan. This happens to be in Herat, 2 megawatts, and 15,000+ Afghans benefiting as a result of the power generated from this one system. And then looking at the impact. I put this slide up because we built a road in Chakcharan city, which is the capital of Gore province in the middle of the country. We put in solar street lighting as part of the road system. But impact can come from different and surprising places. And this photograph captures one unexpected benefit, whereby school children at night could sit under the solar lights along this new road and study for school the next day. They didn't have power, they didn't have light in their homes, but this provided them with light at night for studying. This is a snapshot of what my agency has done over the years. Roads, schools, airports, hospitals, health clinics, prisons, and power plants. All of them generating impact for the people for whom those have been provided. Schools in the earlier days and schools once we've finished building them to give children safe learning spaces and given opportunities for the future generations of Afghanistan. And to finish off, as I said, a quick look at security. Security was always going to be an issue. It always has been an issue. It hasn't been easy operating in Afghanistan, that is for sure. And it has materially become worse and worse over the years. And it got particularly bad in 2018 and 2019 as the Taliban themselves saw an opportunity. By 2019, when the Doha Agreement was being signed, they saw that they had basically achieved their intent. They went for broke and it worked. Other players came in, which made it more hostile. Technology advanced for those of the terrorist ilk. They even managed to work out how best to destroy V6 armored vehicles. And the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan, having been ejected from Iraq, having been ejected from Syria, they ended up exerting more and more influence, and today exert more influence in Afghanistan, especially in the east and in the north. And this is going to be an issue, not only for Afghans, but also for the international community. And indeed, it is something that the Taliban, the new regime, is going to have to deal with, and deal with quickly. Risk of the uncertain political environment. Nobody knows where it's going to move, how it's going to develop. Until perhaps the Taliban regime is internationally recognized, security will continue to be a major concern for those trying to deliver on behalf of the Afghan people. Where there is a lack of freedom of movement, so there is hardship and challenges in delivering aid. And while the new regime is in place, unrecognized, that aid is not flowing. And one of the greatest risks to the Afghans at the moment is a deflection of the interests of donor countries to other hotspots which are emerging, Ukraine being one current example. And if the donors don't remain committed to the Afghan people, especially after the last 20 years, and bearing in mind the new regime, then it's anybody's guess as to what the future really holds for those young Afghan girls that we saw earlier in the presentation. I think with 25 seconds left before I hit the 30-minute mark, that's it. And should you have any questions, I can assure you I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much for your time.
Up